Hello everyone and welcome to my review for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I'm your host, Colors Fade. Valhalla is the third game in the RPG trilogy that encompasses Layla Hassan's present-day storyline. This time, the player takes on the role of Eivor, a Viking from Norway who follows his brother Sigurd to England in the hopes of conquering Britain and making it their new home. Valhalla is the logical next step in the evolution of the Assassin's Creed trilogy of RPG games that consists of Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla. I say logical next step because Origins was, at its core, primarily a stealth game. But with Odyssey, Ubisoft began to shift the focus towards open combat, and with Valhalla they embraced open warfare fully, making it a major part of the gameplay. And that's fitting because this is a story about Vikings attempting to conquer England. That's not to say stealth isn't a part of the game, it very much is. But more than any other Assassin's Creed game, in Valhalla, stealth is an optional component that can be utilized at the player's discretion. To facilitate this shift in combat focus, Ubisoft has constructed the largest skill tree in the entire franchise, along with a bevy of different weapons, armors, runes, and cinematic combat finishers, resulting in a very visceral, fast-paced, and fun combat experience. But games are more than their combat mechanics, so the question remains, is Valhalla worth your time? And the answer is, it depends on how well you like Ubisoft's games in general and how narrow in scope you feel the Assassin's Creed experience ought to be. Valhalla certainly has moments where it shines. The landscapes are gorgeous, exploration feels rewarding, and the accompanying soundtrack does a great job matching the mood and tone of the game. The main narrative arc is satisfying to play through, and the core gameplay loop is as good as any Ubisoft game I've ever played. And of course, the combat is incredibly fun. In short, Valhalla possesses all the core elements to make it a truly great game. But like a lot of other Ubisoft titles, it overextends itself, and because it does, it overstays its welcome. Valhalla's story is a bit like Cerberus, the three-headed dog from Greek mythology that guarded the door to Hades, a creature that, coincidentally enough, you can actually encounter in the prior game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The first head of this story and the core narrative arc belongs to Eivor, the protagonist, and his brother, Sigurd, heir to his father's throne, as they attempt to make a new home in Britain. Eivor calls Sigurd his brother, but the two aren't related by blood. Instead, they are bonded by past events and personal loyalty. When Sigurd's father bends his knee to fellow Nord King Harald in exchange for peace, he forfeits Sigurd's future crown. This enrages Sigurd, causing him to depart Norway rather than live under King Harald's boot. Eivor, ever the loyal Drenge, joins him, along with a host of other villagers, and together they set sail for England, following in the footsteps of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, hoping they can claim a piece of England for their own and give Sigurd the crown he was so painfully denied. If Sigurd and Eivor's arc is the first head of this Cerberus storyline, the conquest of England is its second. Like Origins and Odyssey before it, Valhalla possesses a massive open world, and I mean massive. This is an absolutely huge and beautiful world to explore, full of rolling hills, rivers, towns, monasteries, ruins, caves, and fortresses. It falls to Eivor to travel to each of these regions on the map in search of allies for his newly founded settlement of Ravensthorpe. Every region in the game has its own unique storyline, along with a host of treasures, mysteries, and artifacts to discover. And honestly, this is the best part of the entire game, this core gameplay loop that has Eivor traveling from region to region, becoming embroiled in the local political drama, then exploring, looting, and fighting his way to glory. Upon completing a region, Eivor returns to Ravensthorpe to make further improvements to the settlement, some of which provide services such as a vendor, access to DLC, or they improve the feast buff that temporarily boosts Eivor's fighting prowess. This part of the game is really satisfying to play, and if Valhalla had been just that, it would have been a masterpiece. But like so many other Ubisoft titles, it wants to do more than it needs to, and that's how we reach the third head of this narrative beast, the contemporary story arc, also known as the Layla storyline, or maybe even the Isu Cataclysm storyline. In present day, Layla Hassan and her friends have discovered Avor's grave in Northeast America, and now she has entered the Animus in the hopes of figuring out a way to thwart a solar flare catastrophe that threatens to destroy all life on Earth. This is part of the overarching narrative that spans the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, and one that I wish Ubisoft would have ignored when it came to the RPG trilogy of games. I know many Assassin's Creed fans will disagree with me on this point, and that's fine. We're all free to have our own opinions on this matter. But I felt this way when I was playing Origins and Odyssey, and it still holds true for Valhalla. The Layla storyline and the Isu Cataclysm storyline in general is the least interesting part of these particular trilogy of games. That's not to say that the storyline itself isn't interesting, because it is. I actually dig it quite a bit. But the basic problem I have is that it's so tangential to the historical story being told in each of these games that it never feels like it matters, and instead it ends up becoming an annoying distraction at best. Now, truth be told, out of the 3 games in the RPG trilogy, out of Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, the Isu Cataclysm storyline has the most direct connection to Valhalla. Without going into major spoilers, I will say there is a very interesting and somewhat shocking reveal late in the game that is quite fun to experience. Unfortunately, for that moment to make much sense, one needs to play through the entire Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, which is not the best content the game has to offer, and I'll explain more about why that is later. The point I want to make is, but one singular reveal at the end of the game, as entertaining as it is, isn't enough to make suffering through Layla's scenes in all 3 games worth the effort, at least in my opinion. Which is why I believe that Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla all would have been better games if they had excluded Layla, excluded the Animus, and excluded the Isu Cataclysm storyline, and instead just focused on the personal stories of these 3 protagonists. Their stories are better when we're not being interrupted by Layla and her overarching plotline. In my mind, it would have made for a far better game to remove those elements and instead brand these games as an Assassin's Creed story, rather than muddying the narrative waters with the larger overarching contemporary storyline. As it turns out, that's what Ubisoft did with Mirage. They basically made it an Assassin's Creed story and left out any references to the Animus or the modern day storyline, and focused entirely on Basim's origin story. And in my opinion, the game was stronger for it. That's not to say there isn't a time and place to keep telling the grander, overarching Isu Cataclysm story. Ubisoft has made it clear that they want to keep pumping out Assassin's Creed games, and I'm all for that. So why not integrate that story more fully with the games that players have more closely associated with that particular style of Assassin's Creed franchise game, where stealth and parkour are the focus, and leave the larger RPG games free to be themselves? To me, that would be the ideal mix. Shorter, more focused Assassin's Creed games that stick to the core gameplay elements from Assassin's Creed 1, 2, and 3, and tell the story of the Isu and the Cataclysm, and then have larger RPG games that focus on specific people during interesting periods of history like Black Flag and Origins and Odyssey and Valhalla. Anyway, regardless of what I think, Ubisoft chose to thread the overarching narrative of the Isu and the Cataclysm throughout these games, so whether I like it or not, it's there and it has to be reckoned with. But that said, of all the warts disfiguring Valhalla, the Layla Isu Cataclysm storyline is the least offensive. This game has other issues. Before I dive into my problems with Valhalla, I want to talk about the parts I enjoyed, because there was a lot I liked. I spent over 120 hours playing the game to its conclusion, which is 3 times longer than it took for me to finish Mirage, and on the whole, I felt like it was a very worthwhile experience. As I mentioned earlier, the core gameplay loop is really fun, and it's easily the best part of the game. Going from region to region and becoming embroiled in the affairs of the local rulers, hunting for riches, taking the crew on river raids, and searching for mysteries, armor sets, and mythical weapons was borderline addictive. This is some of the most fun I've ever had in a Ubisoft title. The game is also drop-dead gorgeous. I've long said I think Ubisoft is one of the best development studios when it comes to creating visually stunning open worlds, and Valhalla is as good as anything they've ever done. It easily rivals the majesty of Egypt and the lush beauty of Yara. A big reason I love Ubisoft's games is because they build really beautiful worlds that are fun to explore, and getting to play in this fictitious version of England was a blast. But I found Valhalla enjoyable in other ways as well. For instance, it has the deepest equipment customization of any Assassin's Creed game. It features a number of different weapon types and armor sets, allowing players to customize Eivor's playstyle and appearance. And the armor sets are beautifully rendered. Each set possesses 2 unique bonuses, the first of which goes into effect when 2 pieces of armor are equipped, and the second kicking in when the entire set is worn. Both armor and weapons can be upgraded, and doing so unlocks rune slots, which allow further customization and potency. And there are some really fun high-level runes in this game. I found one that gave a chance for the player's weapon to light on fire, while another could create a ring of fire around the player upon a successful parry. But perhaps my favorite was the rune that left a trap on the ground when performing a headshot kill with a bow. I got a lot of mileage out of that particular rune. Upgrading weapons and armor felt very satisfying and gave a meaningful purpose to hunting and harvesting, which I always appreciated. I like it when different game systems are tied together in meaningful ways, and that's one of the reasons I keep going back to Far Cry 3 so often, because more than any other Ubisoft game, its systems are tightly integrated, making it satisfying to engage in all of them. In addition to the weapons and armor, Valhalla features several abilities for melee and range combat. These are combat actions that require an adrenaline slot in order to use. Executing a combat ability drains an adrenaline slot, which can then be refreshed by killing more foes, or if the player possesses the appropriate skill, by looting items. Abilities like armor and weapons are found via exploration. This in turn places even more emphasis on exploration and navigating the many geographic puzzles that Ubisoft loves to populate their games with. The player can equip up to 4 ranged abilities and 4 melee abilities, and executing them is as simple as pressing the assigned button. My favorite of these was the Mark of Death, a ranged ability that has the player drawing their bow and holding it back, causing it to mark foes until Eivor either releases the arrow or runs out of stamina. When the ability triggers, it launches a devastating volley of arrows for every mark. This was an incredibly powerful ability that I abused with glee. Finally, Valhalla possesses the biggest skill tree Ubisoft has ever created, featuring just about every combat mechanic they've ever animated. The tree is broken up into 3 branches covering melee, ranged combat, and stealth. In the center of these clusters are unique tools, moves, and passive abilities to help turn Eivor into a true Viking Drenge. Some of these skills are simply quality of life improvements, like allowing Eivor's Raven to automatically loot enemies that it kills at range. Other nodes provide additional adrenaline slots or even unique battle maneuvers. Scattered throughout these branches are various nodes that upgrade Eivor's attack, critical chance, stealth damage, evasion, and health, creating a gradual power curve that sees Eivor grow from level 1 to well over level 400. That sounds like a lot of levels, and it is. But what I liked about this approach is that Eivor was always progressing. The game didn't have those lulls that you find in some other RPGs where you're playing for hours and hours on end without your character growing in any meaningful way. For my money, Valhalla has the best weapon, armor, and level progression of any Assassin's Creed game. The landscapes are wonderful, the story is engaging, and the combat is really fun. But like I said earlier, it's not a game without warts. In software development, we have a saying: trying to hang too many ornaments on the Christmas tree. This shares its heritage with scope creep, and it's a phenomenon that causes a lot of software, games included, to crumble under the weight of their own ambition. This, as it turns out, is basically the problem I have with Valhalla. It's trying to do too much, and as such is filled with needless distractions. Valhalla feels like a game made for an audience afflicted with ADHD, as if the developers didn't trust their main gameplay loop to be engaging enough to hold players' attention. It's chock full of diversions and distractions, which is a shame because, as I said earlier, the main gameplay loop is really fun all by itself. In my opinion, it didn't need all this extra fluff. So let's begin with the minor blemishes and work our way up to the real warts. There are a lot of mini games in Valhalla, and you will be bombarded with these as soon as you arrive at the first village during the prologue. These distractions range from drinking contests to a pointless dice game called Orlog to the poet insult battle called Flighting, which I'm not even sure Dr. Seuss could tolerate. Orlog wasn't even a real game during Viking times, it was just invented by Ubisoft for this game. But interestingly enough, Flighting was real. Wikipedia describes it as the poetic exchange of insults practiced between the 5th and 16th centuries. So for over 1,000 years, the Old Norse engaged in their own equivalent of a rap battle complete with diss tracks. Flighting is the only one of these mini games that has a purpose. Winning the Flighting contest improves Eivor's charisma, which can unlock certain dialogue options, making a few situations a bit easier to navigate. But overall, I found the Flighting to be more annoying than interesting, and like all the mini games, it felt like an unnecessary distraction. Then there's the collectibles. This is something Ubisoft has been doing for as long as I've been playing their games, and these runaway leaflets might be the most annoying version they've ever concocted. Upon approaching these leaflets, they will light off for a new location, beckoning the player to follow. After a few seconds, they reset to their original location. This necessitates following first with Eivor's Raven and then leaving a marker on the map at the appropriate destination. Once the leaflet resets, the player can then make a beeline for the destination before the leaflet arrives. The reward for this time-wasting endeavor? Nothing more than a tattoo design. So at least they're easy enough to ignore. But if you have ambitions of 100%ing this game, these are going to become an annoyance real fast. The bottom line is that Ubisoft has put a bunch of mechanisms into the game that don't seem to serve any purpose other than to pad the amount of time the player spends playing, as if the development team's fiscal bonuses were tied to the total time played by their customers. My feeling is that this would have been a better game with some of this unnecessary fluff carved out. Any discussion of Valhalla's merit needs to take into account the DLCs. They are a very mixed bag in terms of quality and entertainment, and taken as a whole, they basically double the amount of time it takes to play through the game. Certain DLC help make the story make more sense, and other DLC flesh out particular aspects of the game that needed a bit more substance. And then there are some DLC that are just downright fun to play, while others are absolutely dreadful to have to get through. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to cover the DLC in order of release date. River Raids was the first DLC released on February 2nd, 2021. It was also the first free DLC, and it expanded the concept of River Raids, a feature that existed in the base game, but in a much more simplified form. What the DLC added was a whole series of rivers on a separate map from the main game that provided a more involved and immersive river raiding experience. In the base game, you can find several locations to raid with your crew, and these targets provide books of knowledge, which grant abilities, or they can provide weapons, armor, and crafting materials. They also always provide building supplies and raw materials, which are the two components necessary to construct and upgrade the various buildings at Ravensthorpe. However, when raiding these locations on the open world map, your crew is essentially immortal. If they fall in battle, you can simply hoist them back to their feet with the firm grasp of your hand. The only person who accepts any risks during these raids is Eivor. The River Raids DLC changed all that by creating a roguelite experience that causes enemies to scale to your current level and adjust your own crew to have levels of their own, which allow them to utilize rations to prevent wounds. The roguelite part means if you die during a raid, if Eivor dies, you lose any loot you acquired up to that point in the raid. This makes river raiding a much more tense and strategic experience. Since each crew member has levels, they become more effective in combat the higher their level climbs, and they can carry more rations, which will heal them when they are downed. If they end up consuming all their rations, they become injured, in which case you must use one of your own rations to heal them. If you don't have any rations or don't want to use any because you're saving up for a boss fight, then your crew member will become wounded and they'll have to skip the next raid or two as they rest and recover. This necessitates hiring additional raiders to fill out your crew for the next river raid. In the base game, you have a single Jomsvikinga, which you can customize with the weapons and armor you currently possess. This character carries over to the River Raid DLC and grows in level to match your current progress in the DLC. Much like the pawns in Dragon's Dogma, your crew of raiders for the River Raids DLC come from the pool of other players' Jomsvikingers. You can use foreign building supplies that you acquire from the River Raid DLC to increase the level of your River Raid barracks in Ravensthorpe, and as you do, it allows you to recruit higher level crew members from other players. All of this is a welcome change that creates a more tense and strategic River Raid experience. For instance, when my crew was low level and couldn't hold many rations, I often jumped from the boat before the raid started and snuck into target locations where I would silently assassinate as many enemies as possible before calling in my crew to secure the loot. Then later on, when my crew was pretty powerful, I would just call them in from the start. All in all, I found this to be a really fun DLC. My only disappointment stems from the fact that the changes it offers only apply to the self-contained roguelite raids in the DLC. Even the building supplies you acquire on these river raids only affect the buildings associated with the River Raid DLC. They don't affect anything else in your settlement. None of these new mechanics, like crew members having levels or using rations to heal, affects the base game raids at all, which I found to be a shame because these changes make every part of river raiding more interesting. That said, I thought the River Raid DLC was definitely worth the time and effort, particularly because it provided some quality loot, including a really good set of armor with nice bonuses that you could obtain very early in the game since all the enemies scale to your level. I enjoyed the added tension that the roguelite design provided, and I really loved some of the locations you encounter later on, like the dark and foggy Druid Groves, because they were super creepy and provided slightly more challenging enemies. The only downside to this entire DLC is that because it's a roguelite encounter, Crash to Desktop could wipe out all your progress, something that unfortunately happened to me. Wrath of the Druids was the first paid DLC released on the 13th of May 2021, and in terms of size and content, it's the biggest expansion to the game. In some ways, it's exactly what I want from an expansion, as it takes the player to a new land, introducing new characters and a new story, and then gives players more of what they've already come to love in the base game, without adding anything that significantly drags down the experience. In another way, though, Wrath of the Druids is a bit of a disappointment. It's a missed opportunity in terms of storytelling. The name alone evokes a certain expectation for what this DLC is all about, and after playing through the River Raids DLC, I was primed for more dark and foggy Druid madness, because the Druid Groves were my favorite part of that one. But this expansion could have just as easily been titled Building the Irish Trade Network. The DLC begins when Eivor accepts an invitation to visit Ireland from his cousin Bareth, the King of Dublin. Bareth's rule is tenuous at best because the High King of Ireland isn't very fond of him for personal reasons and doesn't like Danes in general. There's some bad blood preventing these two from becoming proper allies. Bareth hopes to change all that by building up a trade network across Ireland and proving to the king that he can be a trusted and valuable ally. This opens up the DLC's first new feature, trading posts. Scattered across Ireland's majestic landscape are various derelict rings that Eivor must liberate and restore. To do this, he must clear out any enemies and then locate the deed, which is often lost in some faraway location. Once restored, the trading post begins generating a specific type of trade good, which can then be turned in at Azar's shop for rewards. This is a fine way of slowly doling out the rewards the DLC has to offer, but it makes for a really slow and boring start to the DLC. I don't know about anyone else, but trade routes and trading posts always bore the hell out of me in video games. This happened with Neverwinter Nights 2 when the Storm of Zehir expansion arrived and turned a really fun Dungeons & Dragons game predicated on high adventure into a boring slog of travel and negotiations. At least here, Ubisoft has cut out the negotiation part. But the fact remains, Too much trade and not enough adventure makes Jack a dull boy. Fortunately, after we meet Kira, a charming and curvaceous redhead who happens to be the High King's personal poet, the DLC picks up. We're introduced to the next new feature, Pigeon Coops, which unlock royal demands. These are simple side missions that Eivor is asked to accomplish in order to curry favor with the other kings of Ireland on behalf of the High King, thereby strengthening the High King's rule and hopefully improving his relationship with Bareth. What I liked about these missions is that they came with optional conditions called King's Pleas that were oftentimes focused on stealth, which made the missions more difficult to accomplish. As I said earlier, Valhalla is very centered around open combat. There aren't a lot of times when the player needs to use stealth. You can, of course, use stealth as much as you want, and I often did because there are some cool tools that make stealth fun. But for large portions of the game, you don't need to use stealth if you don't want to. However, with the royal demands, if you want to meet all the optional conditions, you will have to use stealth. And personally, I found these missions to be a lot more fun when trying to complete them without failing the optional directives. They were more challenging and forced me to use more of Eivor's tools to achieve all the objectives. But none of this has anything to do with druids or their wrath. The most disappointing part of this DLC is how it handles the druids. The name Wrath of the Druids hints at a story that is heavily influenced by supernatural events, but you'd be hard-pressed to find those elements after many hours of play. There is a fog that hangs over parts of Ireland, for instance, but the druids don't actually have anything to do with it. It's just fog. There are werewolves too, but they only appear as part of one-off encounters like the Trials of Morrigan. I was expecting Ireland to be chock full of dark, foggy druid dungeons like we got in the River Raid DLC, and I was thinking the story might be about how a dark druid cult is turning people into werewolves to build an army of monsters in order to push back and destroy the Christians that have overrun their land. But nope. Instead, we get a much simpler story with a smattering of druid bandits, trade post clear-out missions, and monastery raids. This doesn't make Wrath of the Druids a bad expansion, it just makes it pedestrian. It could have been so much more. There's a better story to tell with druids, werewolves, and the Christian church, but Ubisoft chose to tell the most boring version possible instead. I often give Ubisoft a hard time about their DLC because quite often they go over the top, like they did with the DLCs for Far Cry 6. But with Wrath of the Druids, they chose to dial it back, and I don't think that ended up being the best choice. If ever there was a time for Ubisoft to get a little more supernatural and maybe even a little bit weird, this was it. The Siege of Paris was the second paid DLC released on the 12th of August 2021. It takes place in and around the war-torn city of Paris, and like Wrath of the Druids, it expands the base game by giving the player more of what they've already come to enjoy. It introduces an expansive new map, new characters, a new story, and provides 2 new sets of armor along with a host of new weapons. From a rewards perspective, Siege of Paris is definitely worth playing, especially if you prefer using short swords like I do. And if you like scythes, this is where you'll find a bunch of them. Overall, this DLC adds a couple new things I liked, and one thing that many players found annoying, but wasn't actually that difficult to deal with. To start, Siege of Paris introduces the concept of rebel missions. These are simple infiltration or elimination quests that Eivor can do to help grow his infamy in France. A higher infamy unlocks better items in Pierre's shop, the man in charge of these missions. Some missions are designed for Eivor to do solo, while others are meant for a team of NPCs to assist him. As Eivor progresses through these missions, he can spend the currency he earns to upgrade these rebels and their capabilities, or he can just spend it on rewards for himself. For each rebel ally that survives a mission, Eivor's rewards are multiplied, so it pays to either accomplish these missions solo and ensure the allies survive, or at least take out as many targets as possible before being detected, which is the trigger that causes the allies to get involved. Rewards for these missions are rather nice. Pierre has a good set of armor and some decent weapons in his stock, but the true prize here are the runes that have 2 different attributes on them. This alone made it worthwhile to run Pierre's missions, and I only wish he would have had more of these double-stuffed runes to offer. Outside of the Rebel missions, the DLC offers a good chunk of wealth, much of it hidden behind puzzles, as usual, and a smattering of mysteries and artifacts. The only real negative here were the rat swarms, something that a lot of players complained about when leaving comments and reviews. These little buggers weren't new to Siege of Paris though. They were actually introduced in the first DLC, River Raids, but they only made one appearance that I know of toward the very end, and it was easy to miss them. Although to be fair, I did not miss them, and since I didn't understand how to deal with them at the time, they killed me in the blink of an eye, ending my run, which almost made me rage quit the game. Why Ubisoft felt it necessary to introduce them at the end of the final raid, right before the boss fight, and an expansion built on a roguelite experience where when you die you lose everything, I have no idea, but such is life. The problem with the rat swarms is they cannot be harmed. They can only be driven off. If Eivor wanders into their space, they can stun lock him, since they will very quickly reduce his stamina to 0. If Eivor can't dart his way out of trouble, he'll die in short order. Now, anyone who has followed my playthrough for Pathfinder Kingmaker knows I hate swarms of any kind. I really hate game mechanics where the developers throw enemies at you that you can't kill with the weapons you have on hand, that you've spent the last 100 hours or so using and improving. Fortunately, in the vast majority of cases, the rat swarms in Siege of Paris are fairly easy to deal with. The game's tutorial suggests using your weapons, but getting close enough to swing swords at them is asking for death, and shooting arrows is a waste of ammo. I found using Eivor's infinite supply of torches to be more than adequate for dealing with them, even if it was a bit more time consuming to drive them off this way. In some cases, it's possible to slide an object over whatever hole the rats escaped through, preventing them from returning, but other times, Eivor simply needed to loot whatever item he was after and get out of there. The fun part of the rat swarms is that Eivor can actually use them as a weapon himself when he finds the rat swarm ability. A book of knowledge allows him to shoot an arrow that instantly drops a rat swarm on the target. These are great for killing low-level enemies, but functionally useless on bosses. Still, once I had them, I ended up using them more than I thought I would. They were really good fun. As far as the story goes, there's a political drama unfolding in this war-torn land that sees the Norse knocking at the door of Paris. But after recent setbacks, they figure to be on the losing side of a counterattack if they don't get some help. So they send a small detachment to England and recruit Eivor's Raven clan to their cause, leveraging the time-worn threat that if King Charles the Fat conquers the Norse in France, he'll surely turn his greedy eyes to England next. Not wanting to see that future come to pass, Eivor travels to Paris in the hopes of finding an accord with the king, or at least convincing him to drop any ambitions he has towards England. As political plots go, the story is fine. It's not any better or worse than what's already in the base game, but following this questline along with doing the rebel missions provides enough opportunities for Eivor to see most of the map and loot the majority of France as well. And since that's basically the core game loop for Valhalla, it's all good. I only have two small gripes about this DLC. The first is that the enemies are beefed up to the point where Eivor must use advanced assassination on basically anyone he wants to kill. This is only a minor gripe because most players should have advanced assassination by this point in the game anyway, but it did kind of irk me. The second gripe, and really the bigger one I have, is that there's a scene at the very end where a certain NPC has a reaction that I didn't think fit the moment. It wasn't earned. I felt the writing was wrong, and it dragged down what was, up to that point, a rather enjoyable story. Without going into spoilers, I'll just say that the final moments of the main story are poorly written. Eivor is given a choice between two outcomes, one that is clearly kinder than the other. Unfortunately, even if he makes a promise to choose the kinder option, he still doesn't get a chance to follow through with it because combat becomes inevitable. And because of that, he gets a really crappy reaction from this NPC when it's all over, no matter what he previously said or promised. It's a moment that is entirely the fault of the writing team, and it left a sour taste in my mouth. That said, overall I found this DLC entertaining, and I liked the fact that I left France with real rewards in my inventory. That made it worthwhile to me. A Fated Encounter, the second free DLC, was released on December 14th, 2021. It's a small, self-contained expansion that has Eivor traveling to the Isle of Skye and meeting Cassandra from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, who is there to hunt down an artifact that is causing the people of the island to have horrible nightmares, which in turn caused some of them to lose their minds and go crazy because, hey, Eivor has to have something to fight, right? As story hooks go, I dislike bad dreams about as much as I dislike prophecies and portents. Both are lazy storytelling in my opinion, and you can definitely feel that with this DLC. It's nice to have the voice actress for Cassandra return to this role, but the dialogue she's given is really weak, and Eivor's lines aren't much better. The Isle of Skye is beautifully rendered and has a couple nice bandit camps to clear, but not much of consequence happens here. This is basically one large fetch quest, with Cassandra playing the role of antagonistic sidekick. For me, the only point to doing this DLC was to get the short sword it offers, because it's one of the few short swords in the game, and I prefer those over axes. But overall, even though this DLC doesn't take more than a couple hours to finish, it didn't feel like it was worth the time. It's basically fan service for Cassandra people. I found it to be a little more than an unnecessary distraction, and I was happy to return to England when it was over. The Forgotten Saga was the third free DLC released on the 22nd of August 2022, and like River Raids, it aims for a roguelite experience. Of all the DLC, this was the one where my opinion changed the most as I played through it. I started off not really liking it, and by the time it was over, it was my favorite of the bunch. It begins with Eivor meeting Everold, who has taken up residence on the edge of town. Everold possesses the unique ability to craft items from people's dreams. Excited by this possibility, Eivor enlists the help of Valka, who brews him a potion that sends him to the realm of Niflheim. There, he takes on the role of Odin, attempting to confront Hel and have his son Balder revived. To rescue Balder, Odin must navigate 4 realms, 4 dungeons, and defeat 4 bosses. He begins each run with a modest set of starting equipment, and as he progresses, he acquires weapons, abilities, runes, and upgrades. Defeating enemies and securing objectives rewards Odin with 5 different kinds of currencies. Now, the number of currencies in this DLC is a bit overwhelming at first, but after playing through it, I can see why Ubisoft designed it this way. Odin gains strength in this game through a combination of skills, abilities, equipment, and runes, so the different currencies are simply a way to control these different pathways to power. 2 of the currencies can be used during a run to purchase weapons, runes, abilities, and upgrades from the vendors scattered throughout the realms. 2 other types of currencies can be used back at Odin's camp to purchase skills or buy favors. And the 5th and final currency is used back in the real world at Everold's shop, where he has a nice smattering of powerful items. Now, I don't typically play roguelite games, so I don't have a lot of experience with these sorts of mechanics, but I knew enough about the genre to understand the core concept, which is that you will do the same randomized content over and over again, but each time you restart a run, you retain a certain amount of power. In the Forgotten Saga DLC, that power is retained a couple different ways. You might think the most obvious way for Odin to retain his power from run to run is to keep the weapons, abilities, runes, and upgrades that he finds along the way, but you'd be wrong. When Odin dies, he loses everything he's wearing except for his robe, and this is where I was initially disappointed and annoyed because it sucked to find a really cool weapon only to lose it when I died. However, one of the game's currencies allows for the purchasing of favors back at Odin's camp, and a couple of these favors allow him to retain a limited number of items for the next run. One favor allows him to retain a weapon, and another allows him to retain an ability. So while Odin can't hang on to everything he finds during a dungeon run, he can keep his most prized possessions. This makes favors really powerful and important, so it pays to save some currency between runs in order to buy these favors at the beginning of a new run. In addition, there are a handful of permanent favors Odin can earn by completing quests in the realms themselves. So while I didn't initially like the idea of Odin losing his gear every time he died, I came to understand and embrace the way favors work, and ultimately realized this was just part of the mechanics of this particular roguelite experience, and it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The other way Odin grows his power, and this is the main way he gets stronger from run to run, is via his skills. The skills tree for the Forgotten Saga is a pared down version. It's reduced considerably from the main game and is missing some core skills like advanced assassination. However, his skills, once purchased, cannot be lost when he dies. And as for some of the missing skills like advanced assassination, those actually become available as bonuses on Odin's robes when he unlocks new robes to wear. After making several runs through the realms and getting further and further each time, while also retaining more skills and a few select items, it became clear to me that Ubisoft spent a lot of time fine-tuning this experience. The entire DLC is balanced in such a way that Odin grows more powerful and makes progress, but still has to repeat the realms a few times before becoming powerful enough to conquer the final boss. All the while, there's a story unfolding. Each time Odin returns to his encampment, there are new cutscenes with the other gods like Thor and Freya, and it is here that we learn more about Odin, Baldur, and the whole situation. There are also a couple quests inside the realms themselves, so this isn't just a pure combat roguelite experience, although that's clearly the focus. The best parts of this DLC to me are the area designs and boss fights. The Forgotten Saga has some of the best area designs in the entire game. Landscapes are gorgeous and the boss designs are fantastic. In the end, the Forgotten Saga became my favorite of all the DLCs. It did everything the right way. It was a very focused expansion with a very specific vision, a roguelite saga that told a story while also providing some of the best environments and combat encounters in the entire game. It was interesting from start to finish, and when it was over, Everold provided a few real rewards. It was a complete package that was a joy to play through, which makes the existence of this next DLC so much harder to understand. The final paid DLC was The Dawn of Ragnarok, released on the 18th of March, 2022. And this one is, in my opinion, the worst DLC in the game, and it's not even close. Like the Forgotten Saga, Dawn of Ragnarok takes place in a dream state, and thus requires Eivor to drink a potion created by Valka. The potion spirits him to the realm of Asgard, where once again he assumes the role of Odin, or Havi as he's called by the other gods. But unlike the Forgotten Saga, Everold doesn't play a role in this DLC. So there are no material rewards for the player to gain from progressing through this story, other than a handful of skill points. This expansion exists strictly to tell the story of Ragnarok, and unfortunately it does so in the least interesting, most annoying, and most buggy way possible. The first mistake is Asgard itself. Yes, it's beautiful, but that's the extent of its charm. At its core, this place lacks substance. To put it simply, there's nothing to do here. There are no meaningful or entertaining side quests, no loot to speak of, no wealth, no way to make your character more powerful. And if that weren't enough, this is easily the most annoying location to traverse in the entire game. There are too few fast travel points, forcing Odin to cover vast swaths of ground on foot with long climbs and longer dives. With nothing interesting happening between point A and point B, this quickly becomes the most boring region in the entire game. Not only is Asgard devoid of interesting things to do, but there's no loot to speak of. The wealth that exists is limited to Ymir's stones, which aren't a currency. So the player can't bring them back to the real world, for instance, and have Everold turn them into something tangible. No, if the player wishes to punish themselves and spend the necessary time to collect all of these stones, they can be turned into a shrine for, wait for it, a whopping 5 skill points. The same holds true for Jotunheim, which is where the second chapter of this saga takes place. Visually, it has more going for it than Asgard, but ultimately it's just as boring. Like Asgard, the wealth is limited to Ymir's stones, which can only be turned in for a handful of skill points. There isn't much in the way of side quests or interesting content either. The one thing Jotunheim has going for it is a heavy dose of illusion magic, which is a nifty trick the developers use to hide a lot of Ymir's stones. Unfortunately, knowing how little those stones are actually worth makes dealing with these illusions less fun than it should be. The bottom line is that Dawn of Ragnarok exists for one reason and one reason only, and that is to tell a story that draws a more direct connection between the main characters of Asgard and the main characters in England. The Assassin's Creed series is built upon the concept that a person can enter the Animus and relive the memories of an ancestor due to their shared DNA. This story mechanism goes to hell when Layla arrives because she hacks the Animus and can now relive anyone's memories, not just her own ancestors, but I digress. The point is, in simple terms, the Assassin's Creed franchise is about the connection between characters and their ancestors. And in this case, these connections might not seem obvious at first. So Dawn of Ragnarok exists to try and draw those lines a bit clearer. What do I mean by that? Recall earlier when I said there was a big reveal toward the end of the game. Again, not to go into spoilers, but the first time I played through that ending, a particular character blurted something out that didn't make any sense at all. It was only after playing through the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC that the connections between the characters become crystallized, and then that one line of dialogue suddenly made sense. So I can see why the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC exists, but what I can't understand is why Ubisoft made it this way as a fully playable expansion, because it really is the most boring, poorly written, least interesting, and buggy DLC in the game. And when I say buggy, I mean buggy. Now this is spoiler territory, but I can't talk about these bugs without discussing it. Twice during this DLC, you will have to fight the Great Wolf Fenrir, and both times you will encounter the most game-breaking bugs imaginable. In the first fight, Fenrir will dig underground and fail to come back up to the surface. The only way to reliably get him to return is to hop up on a nearby rock ledge, which causes the game to warn you that you're leaving the fighting arena. As long as you don't fully leave the arena, this will reset Fenrir's position, allowing the fight to continue. The second encounter with Fenrir is even worse, because not only can he glitch against a rock wall and get stuck, but he will periodically dive underground, and unless you play things perfectly, he can get stuck there too. The key to getting through this fight is counterintuitive. You don't want to button mash your attacks. Instead, at key points, you want to allow Fenrir to win. The minute he starts to dive underground, the player needs to stop attacking. Get close to the middle of the arena, heal up if you need to, and just wait for him to surface, and then allow him to toss you in the air and bite you. If you attack at any point during this and break this sequence, you can break the entire encounter. This was bugged from day one of the DLC's release, and it's still bugged 4 years later, so be warned. The boss fight bugs are bad, but at least you can get around them. Unfortunately, you can't get around the story, which includes some of the worst writing in the entire game. Thor, Tyr, Freya, and Loki all make appearances in this DLC, and they are all painted as one-dimensional morons. Thor especially. He makes his first appearance in the Forgotten Saga, where he's somewhat interesting, but here he's reduced to playing a one-note meathead whose entire personality basically boils down to Hulk smash. It's embarrassing what the writers did with him, and that goes for basically everyone involved in this DLC. That these gods can't discern the obvious danger being presented to them by this idiot builder when we, the player, can clearly see what's happening is beyond frustrating. Not that Ubisoft's writers have ever been able to wield subtlety very well in their storytelling, but here they've discarded subtlety entirely. It's not even a consideration. Instead, we have to suffer through this utterly predictable narrative arc, wondering all the while when we're going to get the chance to push back against it in any meaningful way. The answer is never. Dawn of Ragnarok is a DLC that, quite frankly, didn't need to be made. You know that joke that goes, "This could have been an email?" Well, Dawn of Ragnarok could have been a cutscene. And honestly, it would have worked better that way. There's one cutscene at the very end of this DLC that, had it been expanded just a little bit, would have done all the storytelling Ubisoft needed it to do. I know nobody probably wants to sit through a 5-minute cutscene in an Assassin's Creed game, but it sure would have been better than playing through multiple hours of this garbage. The final DLC, The Last Chapter, was released on the 6th of December 2022 and was a free DLC, and it basically allows Eivor a chance to say goodbye to everyone. It's sort of Valhalla's version of the ending to Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. In theory, this is a welcome addition to the game because by default, the credits don't roll once you complete the main story, which I found really strange. I was really surprised and disappointed by the lack of a credit sequence the first time I reached the end of the game. Credit sequences have become standard fare in the industry, and I find it very satisfying to reach the end of the game and see the credits roll, and to see the names of all the people who poured their time and energy into this endeavor. That said, you won't actually be able to start this DLC until you reach certain game conditions. It's not enough to finish the main storyline. By the time you reach this point in the game, you may not have the stamina to spend the time necessary finishing up all the prerequisites just so Eivor can hug folks goodbye. Vinland wasn't a DLC, but I wanted to take a minute to talk about it because it acts like a DLC. And like Dawn or Ragnarok, it's one of the worst and most unnecessary parts of the game. This side quest has Eivor traveling to North America to deal with an old grudge. The map is small and the content it provides is very brief. It only takes an hour or two to plow through all of this. But what's worse is that Vinland relies on that tired old RPG trope, similar to the go to jail quest, that relies on the player being stripped of all their weapons and armor and forced to play as if they were a level 1 noob all over again. I always find this particular trope annoying, and it's no less tiresome here. After 100 hours of gameplay, my character was reduced to chasing turkeys across a hillside and punching them with his fists because he had no weapons. This is not my idea of fun. Fortunately, the game doesn't relieve Eivor of his abilities or skills, so as soon as he finds a basic weapon, he's lethal again. But that can't stop this particular side quest from feeling underwhelming, unnecessary, and annoying. The good news is that most of this content is optional and can be skipped. So if you want, you can beeline for the grand finale and be done with Vinland. But if you're like me and you don't like skipping content, or it bothers you to have quests pending in your journal that you can't erase, then you're gonna be annoyed by this. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the technical hurdles I faced while playing this game, because there were several. For starters, I had trouble getting 2 of the DLC to work. Valhalla was gifted to me on Steam by a friend, and apparently they bought me the Ragnarok version, because while I did have access to the River Raids DLC, Fated Encounter, and Ragnarok, I couldn't access Wrath of the Druids or the Siege of Paris. So I purchased those DLCs myself separately on Steam, and just to be sure, I also bought the Season Pass. However, even after buying all those extra pieces, I still couldn't get that content to show up in my game. I contacted Steam support and I opened a ticket with Ubisoft support and received no response from either one. In the end, the only way I was able to play through all the content in the game was to disconnect my Ubisoft account from my Steam account and purchase the complete edition of Valhalla via Ubisoft's own store and run the game exclusively through Ubisoft Connect. Once I did that, all the content showed up in my save game. Thankfully, I didn't have to start a new game for everything to work. It worked off my existing save game from my Steam version. Ubisoft Connect still reported my game as being owned by Steam, even after I disconnected the account, but nevertheless it all worked. If I had to guess, I'd say my problem with those 2 DLCs were caused by my version of the game being a gifted version, but I have no way to verify that, and since nobody from customer support contacted me, it's hard to say. My suggestion to anyone who actually wants to play Valhalla is to purchase it via Ubisoft Store, not via Steam, and play it exclusively through Ubisoft's own launcher. For myself, I won't be buying any more Ubisoft games via Steam. It seems like the best way to play their games is via their own launcher, sad as that may be. In addition to the frustrating issues with the DLCs, I also had problems with the game crashing a lot, which was a real bummer because the one thing I've always appreciated about Ubisoft's games is that they always run perfectly fine on my PCs right out of the box. Of the Ubisoft games I played, which includes most of the Far Cry franchise and several of the Assassin's Creed games, every single one has worked on my PC without a single technical issue. But not so with Valhalla. I had a number of crashes over the many hours I played, which seemed to increase in frequency the longer the game went on. I tried all the recommended solutions, including running the game in an administrator mode, turning off the Uplay in-game overlay, adjusting the priority of the Valhalla executable process through Windows Task Manager, setting the exe as an exclusion in Windows Virus Scanner, among other things, and nothing prevented crashes. In the end, after inspecting the Windows Event Viewer following a crash, I came to the conclusion that this is caused by instability in modern graphics cards. I discovered a YouTube video, which I will link to in the description below, that shows how to adjust certain parameters of your PC to potentially fix this problem. The only recommendation I didn't perform was to undervolt my graphics card, which would have been my next step. But after following the instructions in this video, my crashes were significantly reduced. They didn't disappear entirely, but I suspect they might if I were to undervolt my graphics card. At any rate, these steps reduced my crashes enough to make the game playable. But this was a huge problem for a long time, and it nearly caused me to quit the game for good. The other technical issue I experienced was related to texture streaming. It just didn't always work properly, and the only real way to fix it when it started to glitch out was to restart the game. Also, putting the game in borderless window mode caused it to draw in an incorrect resolution, screwing up my OBS recordings. So despite what the configuration said, I don't know why in this game it didn't work, it just didn't. All in all, this was definitely the buggiest Ubisoft game I've ever played, and I found it disappointing that 4 years after the game's release, these issues persist with no apparent fixes on the horizon. I know I've levied a lot of criticism at the game during this review, but the message I want folks to take away is that despite the issues, I really liked Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I liked Eivor as a protagonist. I thought the voice acting throughout the entire game was great, and I enjoyed the stories Eivor became involved in and the characters he interacted with, especially Eivor and Ceolbert. In fact, Eivor was probably my favorite in the entire game. He, Kira, and Toka were definitely the most memorable characters. I liked traveling across this fictitious version of England, which I found to be beautiful and intriguing, and I liked the puzzles Ubisoft concocted, which made exploration fun and rewarding. And even though Dawn of Ragnarok sucked, I really liked the rest of the DLCs and thought they were worth playing. Mostly though, I really enjoyed the combat. The huge skill tree, the abilities, the armor, the weapons, and the runes made for a really entertaining combat experience. I had a ton of fun with some of these abilities, like the Berserker arrow that would cause enemies to fight each other for a short period of time, or the arrow that would conjure a rat swarm to feast on my foes. And I love the combat finishers. My God, the combat finishers. There were so many and they were so awesome. I cannot overstate how much that made the combat more fun. I still think the game would have been better without Layla, the Animus, or the Isu Cataclysm storyline. And I still hate building rock cairns and chasing tattoo leaflets. But overall, this was probably the most satisfying Assassin's Creed game I've played so far. Granted, I haven't played a ton of them. I have only played Origins, Odyssey, Mirage, and I bounced off Black Flag twice now. But still, of the games I have played, this is at or near the top of the list for me. Granted, Origin remains my favorite because I love the setting of Egypt, and Bayek is still my favorite protagonist. But I felt like Valhalla was a more complete package, and the visceral, satisfying combat kept me coming back over and over despite all the crashes and bugs. So from my perspective, and to answer the question that I posed at the beginning of this video, was this worth it? Yes, it was to me. I got a lot out of this game, and I'm happy I had a chance to play it. So that's it for the review. I'm Colors Fade, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, consider subscribing to my channel, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone.